Okay, and I think that it's as easy as me posting a link somewhere or emailing a link or maybe uploading it to Blackboard or something like that. But we'll have this recording for you to look back on. I would totally suggest that you have that formal and informal assessments planning, investigation planning document handy. It was in Blackboard, because I want to make sure that as we work through these questions, you have all of the information, you have all of the requirements there so that you can get all your questions answered. So give me a thumbs up or a yes or a head nod if you have that ready to go. Okay, cool. Very good. All right, so if you took a look at it, you probably noticed that in part one, there's sort of like three main guiding questions, or maybe four. I think the best thing for us to do, considering that everybody probably has a different amount of prior knowledge, is for me to just sort of work through the assessment process, the eligibility process, and I'll touch on the timelines, I'll touch on the legal requirements, I will touch on the exact assessments that are utilized in the process, and then I will touch on the roles and responsibilities through my little spiel. I very, very, very much encourage you to stop me and ask questions as we go through. Of course, we'll have time at the end as well, but don't hesitate to stop. I really want to make sure that this is clear for you before we move on to the next step. So give me a thumbs up if that's good. All right. This is awesome. Okay, so if we're looking first at the IEP process within a school, there are really specific timelines. These are actual legal guidelines for that process. One thing I'll say real quickly, sometimes Zoom likes to kick people out. If you, for some reason, get kicked out, just use the same link to get popped back in. So when we suspect that a student may not be progressing academically in the way that we would hope, we suggest that potentially this student's lack of academic progress could be due to a disability. One of the things that I think is really important for everyone to understand within special ed as a process is that special education is not for all students who aren't making good grades. You know, I think there's a misconception about who special education is for and the supports that are in place. If you're a student who's not progressing academically or not meeting the expectations for academic progress, it doesn't automatically mean that you're a student with a disability. And it also doesn't automatically mean that you're a student who qualifies to find themselves getting support from special education. All students, disability or not, would benefit from extended practice and more specific and individualized instruction. That's any student. Special education is particularly for students who meet two general criteria. The first is that they have some sort of disability that is underneath that IDEA disability category list. But the second important factor is that that student's disability is having a direct adverse effect on their academic progress. So just having a disability alone does not mean that you qualify for special education services. You could be a student with an attention challenge, but if you're making academic progress, you're not going to qualify automatically for special education services. You could be a student who's not making academic progress, but if you don't have a disability, if you're not eligible under one of those IDEA categories, those 13 categories, you're not someone who qualifies for special education. So in order to qualify, you need to meet those two main benchmarks. And I'm going to assume that this is not the first time you've heard this, right? So you first have to be found eligible under the criteria for a disability. And secondly, that disability has to have a negative or adverse impact on your academic progress. If a school team feels like a student is suspected of having a disability, they will first initiate something we refer to as pre-referral. And this is the point of the process where either the parent or the teacher or frankly, any adult that works with a child says, hey, this student isn't progressing academically like we would expect compared to their peers or compared to what we know about students of this age. We think that there might be something going on. During that pre-referral timeline, which is 10 days, the referral team, it could be considered, in your school, it could be called RTI team, or it could be called Child Find. That team is really determining, first, has the school done everything that we can do? Have we put all of the supports that we need in place for this student? Basically, have we tried everything? Yes or no? If we haven't tried everything, that team's going to make a plan to put other things in place. So maybe this is a student who hasn't been receiving reading intervention, so we're going to start reading intervention. Or maybe this is a student who needs a pair of glasses, and we're going to get the student their eye test and get a pair of glasses. So that's the pre-referral sort of moment. And the goal there is to really determine if the child has a pattern of that low academic progress, and if resources have been employed, if they're working, if they haven't been employed, we're going to get them going. At this moment, at the pre-referral stage, the assessments that we use are their grades, their SOL scores, potentially if they're in third grade or higher, any diagnostic reading or math tests. These are the types of things that every student does in a school or a district, okay? So generally we would say this could include teacher-made tests, teacher observations, quizzes, classroom, things like that. Does that make sense at the pre-referral stage? We good? Okay. If that team determines, yeah, we've tried everything. You know, this student has got math intervention, we've got reading intervention, they're going to see Miss So-and-so every afternoon for social skills or whatever. If the team determines, yes, we've tried everything, and we still are not seeing the academic progress that we expect to see, then we enter what we term as the referral to special education. So this is what we would call the referral process. Okay, so the team says, we've tried everything, things are in place, we all feel, including the parent, we feel that we've put everything we need to put in place, so now we're going to make a referral to special education. When a student is referred to special education, that starts that ticking 65-day countdown. Once the referral is made, the clock starts ticking for 65 days. Within that 65 days, this eligibility team or referral team, whatever it's called at your school, is going to gather data from multiple data sources so that they can come back to the table and use that data to take the next step that we'll talk about in a second.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is this the same team as the pre-referral team?
It's different in different schools. Generally, your pre-referral team, it may be called RTI or Child Find, will include an administrator. It will include a gen ed teacher. I personally believe a special ed teacher should be a part of the team, so I always invited myself. It could include a math specialist or a reading specialist, so it varies school to school. It generally does not include a parent at this moment. This is sort of like an in-house team helping teachers make decisions and support their students' academic growth.
Okay.
All right, so the goal of the referral process is to determine what assessments we need to conduct them, and prepare that data to come back to the table. And that's a 65-day timeline. The data that we're collecting during this time is going to be a mixture of formal and informal assessments. So it'll be the Woodcock-Johnson, like you guys are learning to do. There will be some sort of cognitive or IQ test. Woodcock-Johnson actually makes a cognitive test, and there are other ones. I'll give you some more specifics later on. It's going to be a hearing screening. It's going to be a vision screening. There will be a social assessment, which includes generally a social worker speaking with the parent to gather information about the child's developmental history. What's home life like? Was it a normal pregnancy? Sort of all that extra information. And then, of course, if speech is a concern, a speech pathologist may be involved to do assessments. An occupational therapist may be involved if it's appropriate. And if there are behavior concerns, in addition to the academic concerns, there may also be some behavior assessments that are completed. Also, a classroom observation will be done. In the building that I worked at, the classroom observation was done by the school counselor. It's sort of an extra set of eyes, someone who may not work with the student on a daily basis, someone who can be very objective to come and observe. So that's what happens. That's the goal of the referral time, and that's that 65-day timeline. The next step is going to be eligibility. It's the part of the process that we refer to as eligibility. The goal here is for everyone who conducted all of those assessments to come back to the table and use the data from those assessments to determine if the student meets the necessary requirements to receive special education, and if they do meet it, to determine under which disability category. So the eligibility, we'd come back together. Everyone sort of brings their data, literally brings it to the table, and discusses and presents their data. And the team determines if that data is enough evidence to say that, yes, the student qualifies for special education services, and if they do qualify, under which disability category do they qualify for? And those are those 13, I think there's 13, either 13 or 16, don't quote me, those IDEA disability categories. So it could be OHI for an attention challenge, it could be autism spectrum disorder, it could be specific learning disability, all of those disability categories there. Okay, so are we good with that part of the process up until that point? Okay. If at this moment, let's say the student doesn't qualify, then consider this process going back to square one to that pre-referral moment, and that team would then determine, okay, the student doesn't qualify for special education, what are we going to do? What are we going to put in place to try to get this, this student to make the academic gains that we hope for? And what that actually looks like and what additional resources that a school can tap into will be very different based on their location and based on their district. If the team decides that the student is eligible, then we're going to move to step, what I would consider 4, which is IEP creation. So the team, the eligibility team, determines, yes, the student qualifies for special education, and yes, the student qualifies under X disability category. Now the IEP team is going to design that individualized education program, that IEP, using the data from the assessment again, and it's going to be tailored towards whatever that student needs. That IEP, the legal guideline for that IEP, is to be completed and signed and in place and working within 30 days. So we've got a 65-day timeline once we enter the referral to special education step in the process. And then we've got a 30-day timeline once the student is found eligible to get an IEP designed, drafted, signed, agreed upon, and in place 30 days.
What if it doesn't happen in 30 days?
They come and they lock you up and they take you away. Okay, so the technical answer, number one, you don't have to worry about it because you're never going to find yourself in a position where it's not in place for 30 days because you're very organized and you've got your ducks in a row. But let's say it does happen. Technically, the parent has to be given the opportunity, and the student, frankly, has to be given the opportunity to make up any missed instructional time or missed accommodations or missed service time using what we call as compensatory time. So it is up to the school district to figure out a way. Let's say the IEP is a week late and this student is supposed to get an hour of reading services every single day. You've got to figure out a time for that student to get 5 additional hours outside of the school day to make up whatever's missed. And that is a legal contract, in essence. So don't let it happen. And then you don't have to worry about it. I will say, here's what I'll say is 11 years I was in the classroom. It happened twice. Once because we didn't know that the student had an IEP in the first place, and actually the parent didn't know. More on that later. And the second time was weather delay. I learned that mistake my very first year teaching. So to make sure that it didn't happen again, I would always work a month out. So if I've got an IEP due in April, I'm holding the meeting and writing it in May. For this 30-day timeline, I would cut it right in half and I would get that IEP in place in 2 weeks. All right, taking a look at this interview questions, looking at question 1, does everyone feel confident and comfortable with the process and the legal requirements? Okay. The second question is about assessments used during pre-referral eligibility and how they're used for the decision-making process. Does everyone feel comfortable being able to speak towards how assessments are used throughout the process? Speak up if you can't. Maybe. Wavy hand. Thank you, Jasmine. I used to do that with my students too. Okay, is there a specific question that you want to ask, Jasmine, in terms to sort of strengthen your comprehension? Or do you feel like it's something that you kind of ought to let like simmer and sit?
No, I think I just need more like exposure to it.
Sure. Okay. Well, if as you're going through and you're typing this up and you're organizing, if a question comes up, use the Ask Your Instructor tag, because I promise you that if you're thinking about it, somebody else has it too.
Wait, so just to clarify my own understanding. So assessments are just used to determine whether the student is eligible, and then they also use that assessments to determine what services they need.
They use formal and informal to determine if a student is eligible. Yes. They'll use those assessments to help determine under which category. And let's see, do I want to give you a hard yes for assessments and services? Yeah, I would say that the information also helps determine how much reading instruction or whether or not the student qualifies for additional reading instruction. Yeah, I'm going to give you a hard yes on services as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
So the assessment is essentially, once you've taken all that data you've done from informal and formal services, is essentially what they're using to put the IEP in place so that the person providing the instruction can do evidence-based research, essentially.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. Yep. Because that IEP has got to be driven from data. You can't just decide that a student needs math help because you think it's a good idea. You've got to have the data to support that. And everything within that IEP will sort of stem from that data. So you say, okay, the student's behind in math. We need math services. We're going to have math goals, and we may even have math accommodations. All right, the last part of, well, we've got two things to review. I want to make sure everyone feels comfortable with the roles and responsibility, who does what during this process. And then I want to make sure that everyone is super clear about what we would consider a formal assessment and what we would consider an informal assessment. So let's start with roles. Like I said in the weekly video, there are some school districts that have their special ed teachers conduct the Woodcock-Johnson assessment, actually give the assessment. I know Henrico does. Sort of lost track of whether Richmond does or not. But either way, it's going to be your job as a special educator to really interpret those test results. So for example, if a student scores a 94 on the spelling assessment, you're going to need to know what that tells you, and you're going to need to know what it doesn't tell you. And you'll learn that as you start to do these assessments. So even if you're not someone who actually conducts the assessment, your role in all of this is going to be to have an interpretive ear when you hear those assessment scores and standard scores, and to listen out for, okay, on the Woodcock-Johnson it says, lower performing, or like let's say lower performing in reading, and then I hear the gen ed teachers saying, yes, also lower performing in reading. It's really your job to tie those pieces of assessment data together and say, I'm hearing low performance in reading in the classroom, and then I'm seeing it on the assessment. That tells me that this is a student who qualifies for reading instruction. Conversely, if you hear the math teacher say low performing in math, and then you've got an assessment in front of you like the Woodcock-Johnson that's showing you on grade level assessment or performance in math, that's going to make your little special ed ear twinge and say, wait a minute, I've got an assessment that says that this kid can perform on grade level, but I've got a math teacher who's telling me that this student is performing below grade level in math. That's a clue that something else is going on. That's a clue that we've got to look at. Is there some sort of other social emotional factor that's happening in math? If I've got an assessment that says the kid can do it, but I've got a math teacher that says the kid can't do it, or the kid is choosing not to do it. So really throughout the whole process, that's going to be your job as a special educator, is really to match up all these pieces of assessment data. Now don't freak out because you're doing this in a group. You're doing this around a table. You are one of several very intelligent, smart, intuitive people who's going to come to this decision. Also sitting around that table with you could be a school counselor who, like I said before, might complete the classroom observation. You may have a nurse at the table if the nurse has a concern with hearing or vision. You may have an audiologist at the table if there's a really significant concern with hearing. You will most likely have the school social worker who completes the social assessment and who will present data related to the child's social history or medical history. You will certainly have a school psychologist at the table. The school psychologist generally will do the cognitive or IQ testing and potentially any behavioral testing if it's appropriate for that student, if there are behavioral concerns. If there is a concern about speech or language development, you may have a speech pathologist at the table. And if there's a concern about fine or gross motor skills, you may have an occupational therapist at the table as well. You will always have an administrator, and you will always have the parent. The parent will sometimes have a at-home rating scale or assessment to do, so the parent may sort of not necessarily report in the same way, but the parent will give their anecdotal evidence as to what they see happening at school, hearing from the student at school, but then what may be happening in the home as well. And I think that's everybody.
What is the role of the administrator?
Well, I've been really lucky in my experience in my school to have administrators who were former teachers. So generally, they serve as the administrative body or the chairperson of the meeting. So they're making sure they're sort of sitting from a district perspective to make sure that the eligibility process and the team at the table is really meeting all of the district requirements and what the district sets out as their guiding message. The district's requirements and the district's message is really guided by what the state says. So generally the role of the administrator is going to be to make sure that the process is sought out into fidelity, that all of the boxes are checked, and generally that everyone at the table really agrees with the decisions that are being made.
Perfect. Can you repeat what the counselor does, or the school psychologist?
Sure. The school counselor in my building was the person who conducted the classroom observation, so that they were sort of like an outsider, really objective viewer, and they would report on their classroom observation. Usually they'd come observe for 20 or 30 minutes and speak to whether the student was attentive, engaged, how they presented, maybe some things regards to their willingness to participate in class, or any emotional expressions they may have seen. And you asked about the school psychologist? Yes, okay. The school psychologist completes the cognitive or the IQ testing. And then also, if there are behavioral assessments that are being done, it's usually the school psychologist who does that. Everybody feel good about roles and responsibilities? Okay. All right, so last thing, I just want to make sure that you guys have a really strong understanding of the difference between formal and informal assessments, and then some examples of each one, because this will help you as you prepare to complete the second half of your paper. Does anyone feeling brave and want to take a shot at the textbook definition of an informal versus a formal assessment?
I will. An informal assessment is just direct observation, and then a formal assessment is the Woodcock-Johnson, there's more like validity and reliability around it.
Okay, I think that's a really good start. Does anyone want to add to that?
So you're looking at the behavior. Once you do the informal assessments and you get the information from the parents and or teacher and their observations, you then bring it to the formal test, where you then look at those behaviors and write assessments based on the behaviors that were observed in the informal.
Okay, so it sounds like you're really making a link between using information that you collect on an informal assessment to help you decide if using a formal assessment may actually be necessary. Did I catch that?
I didn't miss the question. You broke up.
Oh, I'm sorry. It sounds like you're really speaking towards the ability for results from an informal assessment to help you consider whether we need to pursue more formal assessments, like specifically in the special education process. Am I understanding your message?
Yeah, so I was looking at it this morning and taking notes from the book, and that's what I grasped when I read the book and then went over the PowerPoint.
Yeah, totally. So I think the biggest way to think about it, and I'm going to be perfectly honest with you, when you guys go into your schools, it's not often that you'll hear the words formal and informal, but you'll need to speak to their essence. Okay, I'm just going to put it out there. When we talk about formal assessments, we talk about assessments that are norm referenced and that have gone through some statistical and mathematical reliability and validity measures. Sometimes people confuse the word standardized with formal and informal, but standardized just means that everyone does it the same way. We administer it the same way, and the students give us input or feedback in the same way. The big difference between a formal and formal assessment is the norm referencing first, and then the focus on statistical, mathematical measures to determine reliability and validity. So your Woodcock-Johnson assessment would be considered a formal assessment. When you look through and you read through that technical manual, you're going to see that there's really specific guidelines about establishing reliability and validity and norm referencing process. There are other similar tests that you may hear or come across in your school districts. The Woodcock-Johnson is very heavily used, but you may hear the TEMA or the TERA for younger students, which is a math and a reading. You may hear the WISC, which is the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children. There's something called a Peabody Picture Test, which is for students who are nonverbal. You may hear of a Vineland Adaptive Behavior Scales, which is about daily living skills. You may hear of the Conners, which is for rating characteristics of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And then you may hear the Behavior Assessment System for Children, the BASC. So those are all considered formal assessments. They are norm referenced and they have really strict mathematical reliability and validity measures. Notice that I did not say SOL scores, because SOL scores, as much as they are important and talked about a lot and really emphasized, they are not formal assessments. They are not norm referenced. And I'm not going to speak any more about them, but they would not be considered a formal assessment. They'd be considered an informal assessment, and it's important data. But they don't go through those strict reliability and validity measures in the same way, and they're not norm referenced in the same way that the Woodcock-Johnson and those other formal assessments are. So informal assessments, SOL scores. There's a reading assessment you'll probably learn about and administer called the PALS. There's another reading assessment called the QRI. Even though those are standardized, we would still consider them informal. And then any teacher-made assessment like a quiz or a benchmark test or even a district test, everybody taking the same earth science test would still be considered informal.
So if, based on what I read, is it safe to say that formal tests are quantitative and then informal tests are qualitative, more so?
I think it's generally safe to say that. I'm trying to think if there are, there may be some behavior assessments that are qualitative, but I think generally speaking, it would be safe to say that the formal assessments would be mostly quantitative. But I like this challenge. I'm going to see if I can find one that's not. But all of those ones that I gave you would be considered quantitative. I should, on the informal assessments list, I think that a behavior observation, meaning like a classroom observation, would be considered an informal as well. So like what you guys are doing at your site visits, those would be considered informal. If you do any frequency counts or time sampling or anything like that, your scatter plots would be informal as well. All right, any other questions come to mind or things that I can help clear up while I got you?
Then would an FBA be informal?
Well, you tell me, is there a norm referencing process when you're, okay. Are there reliability and validity measures?
No.
Yeah, we're going to do some things, right? As special educators, as the observer, we're going to do some things to try to minimize the reliability and validity, or sorry, to maximize the reliability and validity and minimize the error. But an FBA would, or any observation that you do for an FBA would be considered an informal assessment.
So when the question says, are certain assessments mandated by the school system? I'm assuming that it's like by district, every school district would have something different in place, and I'll be in Henrico, so Henrico would use the Woodcock-Johnson in addition to formal and informal assessments. Is there anything else that we should know in addition to?
No, I think that's that summary statement that you started with would be the strongest, is that a district makes a decision about which assessments to use, and you can pretty much guarantee that within district, all the students are going to be using the same thing. So when you dig into the Woodcock-Johnson, you'll see that it's starts at a certain age. And for you, Jazz, in Henrico, if they're younger than the certain age, which I'm not going to tell you because I'm going to make you find it yourself, if they're younger than that certain age, then you guys are going to do the TIMA or the TERA if they don't meet the age requirements. But I will tell you that if you can understand and administer the Woodcock-Johnson, the TIMA and the TERA is a piece of cake. It follows the same kind of procedural things. You'll have to think in the same kind of way. So you'll be prepared for that one as well.
So for the Sunday assignment test two, it's just the document that has the questions that we answered today.
Yep. So it's called a paper because I have to call it a paper. But I think you can definitely use that investigations document that we were working from today. I would prefer that it be written in as close to APA style as you can. So when you're talking about you're reporting on your formal assessment, which is the Woodcock-Johnson, you'll cite the technical manual where the information came from. If you used an online resource to answer a part of the question, like for example, I'll give you a clue, you can do a search online to learn more about the strengths and weaknesses. It would be appropriate, so as not to plagiarize, it would be appropriate to cite the resource that you used. I think an in-text citation is appropriate, and then at the end of your document, if you want to just create a quick little references section, I think that would be fine. Anything else for me?
I think this is clear.
I'm good.
Oh, good. Anything you want me to know that may not be a part of this assignment or activity?
Okay, I do have a question. So as I was doing the reading, I saw that there was a lot of math interpretation.
What do you
And it was like statistical in like chapter 4.
uh,
I haven't looked at the Woodcock-Johnson yet, so maybe I'm speaking prematurely, but I'm hoping that there's something that will help us, some type of tool online that will help us interpret that data.
Yeah, so the Woodcock-Johnson is going to give you something called a reliability coefficient.
Okay.
A quick Dr. Google will
Okay.
let you know what that is. And all you'll need to do for purposes of this assignment, and unless you decide to pursue your PhD or become a statistician, all you will have to know is whether that coefficient shows strength or weakness. And you'll be able to figure that out with a quick search.
Okay. Got nervous.
Yeah, no, don't go too far down into the math. You're going to report a number. You're going to report a number, and then you're going to give a quick
I
interpretation.
don't have any questions.
There will be no adding or subtracting in your future, I promise. All right, are we good? Anything else? Going once? Going twice? All right, guys. Well, I will save this recording and put it somewhere, and then I will let you know where it ends up. Of course, if anything else comes up, speak up, okay?
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all. Have a good afternoon. I'll see you soon.